So, hello and welcome back yet again to another Christine's Unhinged retellings and recaps of a chapter of a book. I feel like I'm getting a slightly better handle on this, although again, all of the writing is something that I have not done since I was very much younger, and oh, I have lost the callus on my finger. I remember when I was a kid in school, I always had a callus on this finger because it was the one that my pencil rested on. And I'm one of those that like grips a pencil super tight. I never quite got the hang of, flowy, loose and everything. Although you'd never guess that I grip the pencil so tightly looking at my chicken scratch. But yeah, so I have gone through chapter 13 in The Phoenix Unchained and written down some thoughts and pulled a few of the passages and kind of just highlighted them because they are definitely, I feel, worthy of being quoted. Um, this is chapter 13 of The Phoenix Unchained and my thoughts as we recap it. Now, hopefully, hopefully I'll do a decent job. You might also notice we are missing Lumiere. I'm sure that Lumiere is fine, and if I can figure out how to fix him, he will be even more fine. I bumped it the other day before I did the recap in Lady Night, and when I bumped it, the light went out, and I was like, that's weird. So I just turned it off, and then I later on, after it had cooled down, because lava lamps get very, very warm, but after it had cooled down, I pulled the top, which I put right there, out, and I looked down and I was like, all right, well, maybe the light bulb just burned out. The next time I get to like Walmart or one of those big stores, I can probably just get a new light bulb. So I went to unscrew it, and it it had broken. So I have to figure out how to unscrew that tiny little light bulb way in the bottom of the base. And I feel terrible. I'm starting to wonder if maybe I just personally use the things like lava lamps way more than you're supposed to. Because this is Lumiere number 2 that's had this happen to it. Or maybe they're just not made maybe they're not made to be used on a daily basis. That could be it. It's probably a me thing. Pretty much everything I figure is probably a me thing. How are you guys? I hope you guys are doing good. I actually had a fantastic day today, and I hope that you guys all did too. Like I said, I did a few things today. I went into town. I do need to do some more research on some of the books that I found that I'm pretty sure are all public domain. And maybe once we finish the recap of Lady Night, which we're almost done with, maybe we will shift to doing these recaps and alternating that with reading a public domain book, maybe. I picked up, I'll have another video out probably tomorrow or the day after showing you the books that I have been able to find so far. I still do need to make sure that they are all 100% safe to read on YouTube and maybe get you guys' feedback on which one you would like to start with. 3 of them I found are quite interesting looking because they look like they might be from the 1800s. They probably were reprinted in like maybe the 1910s or so. They're very old. And I found them at a resale store in my town where there's no price on any books. They just ask that you give a donation. It's called the Good Neighbor Store. And all books, they're like, just give a donation. And so I gave what I felt was a very fair donation. There was a part of me that was like, just drop $1 in the piggy bank. And then I was like, no, we need to give a little bit more than that. These are good people trying to help the people in our community. So I gave a donation for them. And then I also went to our local brick and mortar bookstore, which is such a wonderful thing that I love having, and went into their classics section and picked up 2 more books that I was like, okay, I'm 99.99% sure that these are public domain. Before I read anything, we are going to be 110% sure that they are okay to read, but I'm pretty sure they are. And the bonus is that I haven't read any of them, except maybe one. There's one that I'm like, I think I at least read the Cliff Notes version of this back in junior high. So we shall see. But that isn't why we're here. We are here to recap chapter 13 of The Phoenix Unchained by the amazing Mercedes Lackey and James Mallory. And chapter 13 is titled In the House of Malkirinath. Malkirinath. I can finally say Germain's last name. Yay me. I probably still butchered it. All right, so in the last chapter, Harrier and Tercel were brought through a magical gate into the Elven lands by a dragon identifying himself as Alkindar, who said that he was going to bring them to see his bonded Germain. I'm not sure that the boys are 100% on board with that yet. Harrier was arguing a lot. They were met by a couple of elves who seemed kind of hostile. But then again, so did Harrier. Harrier has been very argumentative because he was hungry. They were escorted back to a room, told that they would meet Germain later, and that they should go and rest and refresh themselves and suitably attire themselves. So that is where we left off. And in chapter 13, Tercel is lounging about for several hours. He didn't really know how long he was lounging, but it was long enough for him to have a few drinks, have a couple of refills, and to have to, like, turn up the wick on the lamp that he was reading by. Eventually, though, Harrier, who was sound asleep, came wandering in and comments that, yeah, of course, you found a book, didn't you? Have you seen the elves? Tercel lets him know, no, I haven't seen the elves. And it suddenly occurs to Tercel that he's lounging about in basically a house robe. Harrier, of course, came out of his room fully dressed. Tercel goes and checks out the elven clothing that has been left for him and has a lot of issues with it, but that's because elven clothing and human clothing seem to be nothing alike. According to Tercel, it looks like something that he might wear to a festival masquerade back in the city. He was kind of surprised that Harrier had not just insisted on putting his own dirty clothes back on, but both of them had definitely heard the elf who was their host say that they should get dressed in suitable clothing. Tercel figures out most of the clothes, except for the belt or the sash or whatever it was. He had no idea what he was supposed to do with it because it was so long it could wrap around him about 6 times. He finally just wraps it a few times around his waist, ties it in a knot, and says, this hopefully is good enough. Once he comes back into the sitting area that is in their suite of rooms, Harrier is there, and so is one of the 2 elves that met them when they first came through. That is Rill Fanfell. We're going to just call this one Rill, because elven names, goodness. Rill has changed out of his regular hunting clothes, and Tercel's like, Okay, yeah, elf clothes are definitely something that in the city would not really be anything worn. Rill is wearing a very elaborate costume in gray, silver, and blue with an ankle length vest. It has long trailing sleeves. Tercel thinks that it probably should have made the elf look ridiculous, considering he's even wearing earrings, but it didn't. It made him look quite elegant and kind of intimidating. Rill asks, in the elven fashion, he lets them know that it would be really wonderful if he knew that they were rested and ready to have tea. And Harrier's like, we're fine. Would you like to come in? Rill looks a little bit scandalized by that. Tercel notices it. And Rill's like, it's tea time now, and it would please me greatly if I could take you to my great father's solar where you could drink tea with him. Harrier looks a little bit confused, and he's like, okay, well, maybe we can ask your great father some questions. This makes Rill look even more upset. And side note, if you weren't with us when we were reading through The Outstretched Shadow, that is because elves live, at least in this world, in the world that was created by Mercedes Lackey and James Mallory, elves live anywhere around 1,000 years. And they are the world's biggest perfectionists. And they have elevated, according to the last books that we read, they have elevated living into an art. And because they live for so long, they consider direct questions to be almost as rude as like picking your nose at the dinner table. It's considered the height of rudeness. They do not do it. Everything is phrased indirectly because when you live 1,000 years, you have all the time in the world. You don't need to ask a direct question. There are a couple of exceptions to this, and that is children. Obviously, children are not expected to know manners, although they learn very quickly in elvish society, at least this one, and what is called war manners. Although war is a very rare thing, but a lot of elves at least have training in the, I was going to say the gentle arts, the ungentle arts. A lot of elves at least have basic training in sword, lance, horsemanship, things like that. Not all of them, but quite a few. And war manners, it's because if you're in the middle of a war, they are taught that there's not always time to phrase things in an indirect way. So those are the only real exceptions to the whole elves don't ask questions thing. So every time Tercel and Harrier ask a question to these elves, Harrier and Tercel might as well be open mouth sneezing and flicking boogers. You know, it's just considered the height of rudeness. We also have to take into account that elves and humans haven't really been together in a very long time. So these elves, at least, have probably never seen a human. So they're a little taken aback. That is definitely a nice way to put it. But Tercel is starting to get the idea that maybe questions are bad. So he just says, Harrier, shush. And they agree to go and drink tea. They follow Rill through the house and they look everywhere. It's everything they see, all Tercel and Harrier can think is everything here. It looks functional, it looks beautiful, but it also looks like it belongs in a museum. I don't know about you. I've actually been in a few actual people's houses that make me feel the same way, and it sounds really uncomfortable. Although, from every description that we've gotten of elvish houses from the other trilogy, they don't sound like they are really there to make you feel uncomfortable, but it would be uncomfortable for me to be in that much perfection. But finally, they reach the solar, and it's kind of what Tercel had expected, but he isn't exactly sure what he expected. So we're going to read the description of the solar because it just sounds beautiful to me. The chamber was large and could have been glaringly bright, though the roof was not glass but wood, save for the fact that the walls were edged with ornamental jars of varying sizes containing live plants through which the light filtered pleasantly. The floor was tiled and covered with several small rugs whose purpose seemed to be more to decorate the floor than cover it. In one corner of the room, a fountain splashed and bubbled, and at the opposite corner stood a large stove, unused in this season, obviously designed to mimic the shape of the fountain. I love the descriptions of elven architecture, especially when we get into the rooms. This solar sounds absolutely beautiful. I think in The Outstretched Shadow, my favorite room description was of the room of fire and water, just because it sounded so neat. I've even tried to recreate something along those lines in The Sims, but it just hasn't worked out. But it just sounded like such a beautiful contrast. And although it might seem a little bit like living in a museum, maybe I could do it. Maybe I could do it because they also sound very comfortable. So they go into the solar. They spend a little bit of time looking around this beautiful room, and then they look over at the occupants, where there are 4 elves who are already in the room. 3 of them are sitting on very comfortable looking chairs, and the 4th is lying on a divan. And the boys kind of figure that this is who they have come to see, because the man who is lying on the couch raises his hand and says, "Enter and be welcome." The speaker was truly ancient, and Tercel, who had heard all of his lives that elves lived for centuries, hardly dared imagine how old he must be. His hair no longer retained even the faintest trace of black. It was as white as new milk and lay coiled over his chest in a thin braid. His skin had the soft pallidness of age, and there were deep lines around his eyes, as if he had spent much of his long life staring into the sun. The woman sitting beside him was nearly as old as he was, though her hair had a faint bluish tinge, as if a few strands of black were still mixed amongst all the white. Despite her age, her back was straight, and she carried herself with as much grace as the other elves did. She smiled at the ancient elves' words, and then looked up at Tercel, and when Tercel met her eyes, he blinked, for the ancient elven woman's eyes were a deep and vivid violet. So obviously, we all, if we've read the last trilogy, know who they are. She tells Tercel, "Come on, sit down. Germain has been waiting for you for almost 20 turns of the season now, Tercel, but I did have to keep telling him that, you were going to have to be born, then you were going to have to grow up and actually discover your magic, and, then come seek us out." Idalia also lets him know that she's actually surprised to see him so soon because she thinks that they are both very young. Germain points out that they're about the same age that Kellen was when he arrived at Idalia's cabin. And Harrier, well, that's pretty much when Harrier has had enough. Again quoting, "No, wait," said Harrier. "Excuse me, I don't want to be rude, and I know Tercel is the one you've been waiting for and not me, but, we don't really know who you are, and you two are talking like you are the Blessed Saint Idalia and Jermaine Dragon Rider, and you can't be, am I right?" Now, this is considered the height of rudeness by the other elves in the room, but the woman with the violet eyes blinks, and the ancient elf just laughs. And Tercel hears Rill, the elf who has been escorting them around, whisper to Harrier, "Sit down, before you never have to worry about being impolite again." So Rill, this elf who has been escorting them, has had it. He is done with Harrier's nonsense. Idalia lets them know that it's been a very long time since she has had to deal with humans, and she kind of forgot what humans were like. Jermaine says, "Forgive me, this is my fault, but let us introduce ourselves. I am Jermaine, the son of Malkirinath, once long ago an elven knight, but still Ankeldar's bondmate." Though he had never heard himself actually called Jermaine Dragon Rider before, and he also lets them know that this is his wife, Idalia, who once was a human and who is now been reborn amongst the elves by the grace of Leaf and Star. Tercel is sort of flabbergasted. Harrier is completely poleaxed, but Tercel's starting to think maybe this is true, but wait, wasn't Jermaine the king of the elves? Isn't that what he had been taught his whole life? He's also determined not to ask any questions because he is at least starting to realize that questions are considered rude. He also vows to himself that if Harrier opens his mouth, he's going to kick him in the kneecap. Idalia laughs and lets Jermaine know that he's definitely Jermaine has definitely shut the boys up. And maybe now, says Idalia, it would be a good time to tell the entire story because she doesn't actually think that real Fanafel or Eularian actually have heard the whole tale. And it's been at least 20 generations, and more than that, perhaps, outside of the Elven lands since anyone has heard this tale. Idalia lets Jermaine know that human memory is a very fragile thing, and even though they have long suspected that this day might be coming, nobody else, especially not the humans, suspected that this day might come. But before all of that, she says, we should definitely get some tea. I do love that the elves in this universe are tea crazy. I don't know if that is a Mercedes Lackey thing or a James Mallory thing, or if maybe they just came up with it between the two of them, that these elves are just tea obsessed. But in the last trilogy, everything was accompanied with tea. Good news, you're going to have some tea. If it's bad news, you're going to have some tea. You don't feel good? Why don't you have some tea? And I can't really say that they're wrong because tea is a beautiful, wonderful drink. I do like coffee. I drink coffee more often than tea, but tea is delicious. Anyway, there's a little bit more banter. Idalia prepares some tea. Tercel lifts the tea up, gives it a good sniff, and goes, "This doesn't smell like tea," in his own head. This is also a funny thing that was noted in the last books because the elves seem to drink all herbal and green teas, and most of the humans in the human lands drink black and cured leaf teas. It kind of reminds me of like just the difference between East and West, like say a British person having a cup of tea or an American. and maybe going over to Asia where there's a lot more green teas. I would imagine that Elvish tea has a lot more in common with a Chinese green tea than it does with, say, a nice cup of Earl Grey. But that being said, the tea is passed out. Tercel turns down an offer of cake and just keeps going. He, in his mind, he is utterly flabbergasted. He wants to know how on earth could she be the Blessed Saint Adalia? She was an elf. Everybody knew that the Blessed Saint Adalia was a human. And on top of that, the Blessed Saint Adalia was somebody who he has been praying every time he recites the Litany of Light for as long as he's been alive. I could see that being a thing. Harrier tries to fumble his way into a question, and Tercel is like, Harrier, I don't think we're supposed to ask questions. Rill, the elf that has been escorting them around, glares, but Germain lets them know that we are going to set aside and we are going to invoke war manners. Let questions be asked here, and all questions hopefully will be answered. They settle in with their tea, which according to Tercel and Harrier smells a lot like boiled grass, and their cakes, and Germain and Idalia begin to talk. Idalia lets them know pretty much all of the events that happened in the Outstretched Shadow in the Obsidian trilogy. She lets them know how darkness has come back into the world not once, but twice, or maybe 3 times. Once when there were no humans, there were just elves, and that was when the great queen, Valesser Farkanon, united all of the elvish tribes and created a bargain with dragons that would let elven mages be born. Now, the elven mages and the dragons eventually stopped partnering up together, and the demons were defeated in that very first war. After that, there was about 1,000 years. I'm starting to feel a cycle. There was about 1,000 years of peace. You know, it was a bitter war, and during that time, the humans rose to power and discovered the wild magic. Because one of the big bargains with the elvish queen was that the elves gave up most of their magic, hoping to lock darkness out of the world. Obviously, it did not succeed because 1,000 years later, thankfully, after humans had learned the wild magic, darkness arose again in the form of the Undarkened, also known as demons, and there was a huge war. This one was bigger than the first war, and the dragons bonded with wild mages. It was a very close thing, and pretty much 90% of the races of the light by the end of this war, which lasted over 100 years, were gone. I mean, there was almost nothing left, but again, the darkness was banished. Everyone celebrated, they thought it was over. One of the only things that even let the victory happen was the developing of high magic, because high magic could not be corrupted by the demons. Because unfortunately, wild mages were corruptible, ironically through their bond to the dragons that fueled their magic. Because as we have seen in this book, the biggest issue with dragons and humans being bonded is that then the dragon is limited to the human's lifespan, and if you really love something that much, you don't want to think that it's going to die when you do. But the high magic was born, and it was discovered that high magic and wild magic working in unison could actually kill demons. At a great loss of life after about 100 years of war, the humans triumphed. A lot of the races of the light were gone forever, but they thought they had won. Then 1,000 years after that, it turns out they were wrong. And that is the events in the Outstretched Shadow trilogy, in that the high magic has drawn in upon itself and become very insular. The city of Arameth has closed its walls. Wild mages have been turned out. And that is when the darkness rises again. The only real person who knows that the darkness is rising is Kellen. He is the now reborn Idalia's brother. He is a night mage. He not bonds, but befriends a unicorn. He leads the elves. It was a huge battle, and at the end of it, Idalia gives up her life in a place of power, and the great flowering happens. They explain all of this, and that is when Harrier pipes up with, which means they were gone forever this last time, right? The great flowering proves it. No, Tercel said slowly. They're coming back, aren't they? Somehow. The wild magic is a magic of balance, Germain said reluctantly. It transforms but does not destroy. To destroy something outright would be anathema to everything that the wild magic does. So Idalia didn't kill the Queen of the Undarkened, said Harrier. I mean... Harrier stopped, confused, realizing who he was talking to. Idalia laughed. The Demon Queen is certainly dead, Harrier, though it was Germain who killed her and not I. No, it is that there can be no light without darkness, or at least the freedom to choose darkness or create it. Germain lets them know that the wild magic does not offer anything unless there is a need for it. That after the Second War, the Great War, the one that left most of the land barren, the High Mages had built the Golden City and sealed it off, ruling it by magic, until the time of the Great Flowering. He lets them know that Tercel's magic, the high magic, had evolved from war magic, which had been designed to be something that the Undarkened couldn't taint. Now, Eularian says that Tercel is the first high mage, according to Germain, in at least 1,000 years. Harrier is just like, look, wait, you think because Tercel is a high mage, that means the Undarkened are back? You couldn't have known that he was going to be a high mage. Germain then drops the bombshell that not only did they know, but that wild mage Malgwyn was the one that healed Tercel back when he was a baby, recognized that he had the high magic mage gift, and sent word to the elves way back when Tercel was like 2 years old. Tercel's a little bit floored by this, and he's like, wait, no, Malgwyn was a priest of the light. He wasn't a wild mage. Idalia points out that, maybe back when she was a human, a high mage and a wild, or a preceptor of the light couldn't be a wild mage, but there's no rule against that now. Harrier, being Harrier, decides to interject, and quoting again, "So if we can ask you all these questions, I got some," said Harrier. "If Malgwyn was a wild mage, why did we have to come all the way here? And why did Samara have to die? And why do we still not know what's going on, since Tur could have gotten help back in Centaur Shadin?" "Kind of like the wild mage that did eventually find you helped you," said Idalia. It would not have mattered whether it was Ronidia or Melgwyn who said it. The words would have been the same: to come here. Now, Tercel is like, yeah, well, Ronidia told us to come here because you would tell me all about the wild or high magic. If Malgwyn had told me the same thing, well, maybe I wouldn't have come, but Ronidia didn't say that you would tell me what was going on, but will you tell me what's going on? What about my visions? Can you stop my visions? I think the dark is coming. Tercel kind of shut everybody up with that. A few times Harrier is going to say something, and just as many times Harrier's like, no, I want to know what the elves are going to say. Germain lets the boys know that they weren't ready for him. They expected it to be a few years. He was going to send Ankeldar to go and get them, when they were a little bit older. Germain begs their forgiveness because he says that, the elves can't actually help. Because once before that the only Kellen had seen the problem and seen how to fix it. Everything the elves did was based on tradition, and they've learned that if there is a chosen champion of the light, it is best to let this chosen champion discover the way forward for themselves, rather than being perhaps misled by well-intentioned elders, well-intentioned elves. Again quoting. Tercel stared at Germain in stunned disbelief, and Harrier gave a yelp of disbelieving laughter, stifled an instant later when he realized, as Tercel had, that Germain was serious. With a dawning sense of horror, Tercel realized that they had come all this way, lost a dear friend, and now the elves were telling him that he was just going to have to figure things out for himself. So you're not going to help, said Tercel. You brought me all this way not to help? There are goblins out there, and worse. I've seen them. Germain tells him that they'll give him all the help that they dare. Germain says that he has faced the armies of the Undarkened, and he really wishes that he could help more, but this is the only thing that the elves can think of to do. Tercel is very upset by this, but not as upset as Harrier, who's like, we were told to come here. We were told that you would help us. Germain again points out that they learned hard lessons in the last war. All they knew was what Idalia has already told them, that the evil might return. They didn't know when, they didn't know how, and they didn't know anything other than the fact that now Tercel has been born, granted magic, granted visions, and they still don't know if the darkness is going to be back in a few hundred years or if it's ready to strike. The only thing that they can do is to hope that the chosen champion, who looks without expectation, could see what needs to be done. Again quoting, because Harrier is very blunt. So you want Tercel because he's an idiot? Said Harrier after a moment. I would not express it in precisely those words, said Idalia. You want him to get killed, said Harrier. And Tercel recognized all the signs of Harrier working himself into a temper. Harrier, come on. I'm sure they didn't bring me all the way here just to get me killed, and it's really rude of you to say that, don't you think? I have seen too much death, said Germain quietly. I'm sorry, said Harrier. I don't understand. And that is when one of Germain's grandchildren, Eularian, shakes her head. pokes her brother Rilfandel and says, "Let's go out for a walk in the garden." She lets them know that they have probably tired Great Father Germain out a lot. You know, he's old, but he and Nadalia wanted to see Tercel and Harrier immediately. She lets them know in a couple of days he'll see them again, but he's already told you pretty much everything that he can. What he has said is new to her, it's new to her brother, but, even though she's not a elven mage, she doesn't understand the necessities, but every child in the elven lands learns the story of Kellen's war and how the elves almost lost it because they didn't listen to the human. Harrier lets her know that he's sorry that he lost his temper, but it's kind of a crap explanation. She agrees and says, "Indeed, one must suppose that it is not much of an explanation. One must also suppose that all round ears are as incredibly rude as you are." "I guess," said Harrier. "Are all elves as vague as you are?" And she lets him know, kind of bluntly, "I would say rather we have proper manners, as you obviously do not. It will be well for you to learn to be polite and how to speak appropriately in your time here. The war manners are all well and good in times of war. Great Father is a forgiving man who has seen much in his life, but if you are to go out in the city and meet others, it would be desirable for you not to give offense the moment you open your mouth." I like these elves. Tercel immediately puts his foot in his mouth by saying, "Oh, so is he actually your grandfather?" Rilfandel rolls her eyes, calls Tercel around here, and says, "Fine, just for today and just for right now, I will answer questions as though we were in the House of Sword and Shield, even though you're very, very rude. And don't ask questions of anyone but the two of us." We do also find out later on that they are twins. But these siblings are like, you can ask me and her questions. That's it. Tomorrow, though, you're going to have to learn some proper manners, or you're going to be locked in your rooms. And there's probably a lot of things you're going to want to see here in this elven city. Rilfandel points up, the boys look up, and they see dragons. Many dragons. There's gold, there's a green one, there's one that's sort of a pinkish color. And Yularian and Rilfandel let them know that I am not even going to try this city. Okay, let me spell this word for you, and you guys can let me know how you think it's said. There is no wonder why Harrier just calls it Kara Hera Dragonlander. It is KaraHelanderiligor. Karahelleriagor. Elven names. At least elven names in this series. Anyway, they let them know that Kara, we're just going to call it Kara, is the city of dragons. It's where the elven mages live. And that Rilfandel is certain that you will wish to meet the dragons, if not the mages. And now to answer your question, Germain Greatfather is not my father, nor my grandfather, nor my grandfather's grandfather. 5 generations lie between us, of which my sister and I are the youngest. So, if every elf can live to be about 1,000 years old. We definitely know that Germain and Adalia are both over that, because when we first start reading these books, we do know that it has been 1,008 years since Idalia's sacrifice that caused the Great Flowering. Rill also lets Tercel know that Germain has been collecting everything that he can possibly find on the high magic since long before he even knew that it was going to be needed. And then he guides them back to an outbuilding at the back of the gardens. And as they're walking back, Harrier is like, by the way, when are we going to see this city of yours? Rilfendell is like, the city's all around you. Look around. I mean, you humans might build on top of each other, but it seems a very stupid way to build to me. Now, if you look just beyond those trees, there's a couple houses. Go a little bit that way, you'll see some more houses. You could walk for about a day and see most of the city, and 2 days' walk would show you all the farms beyond. And now here we are at the outbuilding that Germain has prepared. They actually reach a building that is very recognizable to both of the humans as a building. They came in, it seems perfectly normal. It's got a nice deep porch, it's got bookshelves all around it, and all sorts of interesting things that make Tercel very excited and Harrier roll his eyes. I mean, there's pretty much everything that a high mage would ever need. Tercel asks where Germain got it all, and Rilfendell is like, Germain gathered all of this knowing that one day they would be needed. Some of the items belong to the High Mage Killarney himself, and others Greatfather has just been gathering. This typically stuns both of the boys, and Harrier is kind of like, wait. This is all the High Magistrate Killarney, the first magistrate. He was a high mage. Wait, how do you guys all know this? Rilfendell tries again to tell them how to ask a question without asking a question by saying, should Tercel wish to know which items were owned by High Magistrate Killarney, he must say to Germain that it pleases him greatly to see the items gathered here, and it would be good to know their history. So that is how you ask a question without asking a question. I do have to let you know, I would be terrible at it, but, you know, it is what it is. Anyway, then they ask the question that might have been the first question on my mind. Tercel wants to know, okay, you got all these books. These are all high magic books. This is all this high magic paraphernalia. How long does it take to actually become a high mage? And Rilfendell is like, that's not how you would say it. What you need to say is, it would be good to know, of your courtesy, if you have any notion how long it takes to learn the spells of high magic. And then Rilfendell says, Greatfather has told me about Killarney the High Mage, who faced his own difficulties mastering his art. He said to me that upon many occasions Killarney had said to him that high mages begin their studies as infants, then labor into old age to master the intricacies of high magic. And then Harrier has to pipe up with, well, in that case, we're in trouble. Then we have an entire month that goes by in the span of a few paragraphs. Well, Tercel dives into the high magic books. Harrier almost never sees him. He kind of sees him leaving to go to the study that Germain has made, and coming back after dark, grumbling and looking upset. This leaves a Harrier a lot of time to just wander around on his own. You know, he's not sure, but he is learning how to get along with elves, mostly because taking a page from Ronidia the Wild Mage, anytime he starts to ask a question, either Rilfindel or Eularian hit him. It is a good way to learn, I guess. Maybe not the best way, but it seems to work. So Harrier is getting along at least decently. He's been around the city, he's met lots of people. They even gave him his own horse to ride while he's there and some riding lessons. And Rilfandel and Eularian also try to give him some lessons in dancing, as they call it. Dancing, according to them, is actually sword fighting. They noticed that he was wearing a sword, and again, we will quote, "Since my sister has seen that you carry a sword, we thought this might be of interest to you," Rilfandel said. He raised his helmet, and he placed it upon his head, concealing his features. Then Eularian raised her sword, which was very large and sharp, and attacked her brother. Harrier watched this with a mixture of fascination and horror. He was fairly certain that the two elves weren't going to kill each other, but the room rang with the sounds of metal on metal, and there didn't seem to be any rules at all to the fight. They didn't only use their swords, they kicked, they punched, and hammered at each other with their pommels. They even wrestled. It looked nothing like the decorous mock battles that he had seen at the flowering fairs, and definitely nothing like the formal parades of the city militia. He had no idea of how much time passed before they stopped. Then Rinfandel says, "I know that you will not be familiar with the elven style, and I will not expect you to have had my years of training in the House of Sword and Shield, any more than you would expect me to know how to behave upon your docks. But it would please me greatly did you give me the opportunity to cross blades with you. Though the crafting of a suit of armor is a matter of moon turns, it would be a simple matter for us to use padded suits and wooden blades and practice together." Harrier thinks really hard about it for all of about 2/10 of a second and goes, you know what? I don't actually know anything about sword fighting, and I don't think I would be any good at it, but I'll just watch you. I mean, the wild mage Ronidia handed me this sword. I don't know why she gave it to me. I think of it as a pointy club, but I do enjoy watching you. Eularian and Rilfandel are like, "Well, then certainly come here and watch. We fight together every day and practice our skills." So Harrier every day starts his day by watching the elves spar and then going for a ride. He doesn't see a lot of Tercel during this month, and he eventually just kind of gets bored. But the one thing that he finds that is absolutely guaranteed to quell his boredom is the dragons. Now, the city that they are in, which we're just going to call Kara, it's the Mage City, and everyone in the Elven lands who is a mage and bonded to a dragon lives here. Harrier had long since found out that Germain wasn't actually the king of the elves. He never had been. He also learns that most of the stories of ancient times are myth and just flat out wrong. But he also finds out that amongst the dragons, the prohibition against questions does not exist. And he also discovers, to his great delight, that dragons are worse gossips than sailors. And that's where we leave off. We actually only have 2 more chapters in this book, and considering how long it took me to get through that recap, it'll probably be 2 more nights of it. But yeah, the boys have met Germain. They have met Idalia. They might not have believed it at first, and Germain and Idalia might be greatly weakened from the ones that we met in the last trilogy. but we've gotten to meet them. Germain has gathered all sorts of things for Killarnan to study, but also I just called him Killarnan, for Tercel to study, but he's also let Tercel know that the elves are going to give him help in books and help in all sorts of other things, but they're not going to actually tell him what to do. So we're going to have to wait and see what else is going to happen. As always, thank you so much for listening. I really do appreciate it. I hope any of that made sense. I feel like I get overexcited and start rambling too much, but I really do enjoy this story. And I love the idea of Germain's like great, yeah, that's 5 generations, great grandkids smacking Harrier upside the head every time he looks like he's going to ask a question. I feel like, if nothing else, he will probably learn to avoid asking questions out of self-defense. We'll see if Tercel is any better at it, because he's just off studying and learning everything that he can learn about high magic in the space of a month. I don't think that's going to be enough time, but we will have to wait and see. Anyway, thank you so much for listening to me babble. I hope that you enjoyed it, and I will see you next time.